Excellency Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development, Vice Minister of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, Ambassador, dear friend Salim, Excellencies, good morning. It is my honor, of course, to be with you today in this very interesting and very important conference, which in fact tackles probably one of the major challenges to making faster progress, which is communication and learning. And I'm very pleased, of course, that it's happening in Vietnam, a country that has lived with its disasters for so many, in fact, hundreds of thousands of years, but that is also consistently picking up on many of the challenges. So, of course, as representatives from community-based practitioners, theorists, and implementers, we do look forward really to the outcome and the discussions of the conference today. The Minister having outlined the goals and objectives and the expectations that are very concrete. And I will, of course, talk to you to start with about the Yoga Framework for Action. What else to expect from me? But before I go into that, maybe I'd just like to, for all, and I hope many of you who have used the Yoga Framework for Action as a framework for cooperation and for practical work, mention to you that we have made globally some considerable progress. And I think it's important to ask for your help to document and give evidence for that progress that is happening in countries at every level. The Secretary General of the United Nations has in fact made it one of his 5-year generational opportunities and priorities. He has packaged it in the word of prevention and disaster reduction. It sits among peace and security, of course, and sustainable development, but it is a clear recognition that countries, rich or poor, cannot sustain the losses that they incur today from disasters and climate risk impact. And I think we should take courage from that, because it means that we do have today an international momentum behind what is happening at local level that you will discuss in the next few days. About 7 years ago, Yoga Framework for Action was adopted. As many of you are familiar with, just after the Indian Ocean tsunami in Japan, and therefore yoga. And many countries then started working very systematically according to the 5 priorities, the 3 strategic objectives, and the overall goal on reducing disaster risk. Vietnam, of course, one of them, but many of you here represent countries and communities that at that moment really started looking systematically at the recommendations about institutional mechanisms, legislation, budget lines, education and awareness, early warning systems, preparedness and better emergency response, which has been really one of the successes, particularly in East Asia and Southeast Asia. And all of you started working on the key message of Yoga Framework for Action, with disasters is a development issue. And unless we can get it into the development thinking, planning, action and investment, it's going to be a major challenge to make some sustainable progress. I would say that countries, all countries, rich and poor, middle-income countries, just like international organizations, just like international NGOs, they all report after 7 years what the main challenge has been. And that has been simply how to reach all levels of society. Because of course we started working at central government level. It's important and critical what governments do. But how to reach community level, and how to ensure that all the positive changes we see at central level in fact are reflected in some changes in people's lives. In 2009, the International NGO Alliance for Disaster Risk Reduction issued a report at the Global Platform for Risk Reduction in Geneva, called News from the Frontline. And what they had done, they had worked with, I think, 600 NGOs or so in the world, national NGOs, to take the temperature at what happened at community level. And they were not reporting very encouraging results, I must say. They say there was little evidence of, at that time, that really the trickle-down effect of what governments were doing on disaster laws, investments had yet come down, nor that really education and awareness. So that was a message to all of us to mobilize more consistently community collaboration, to measure better, and of course that's why the civil society and community work directly is so important. In 2010, the ISDR launched the Cities and Local Governments campaign. I hope you are familiar with that, with the same purpose of really reaching out to the level where, including governments, where implementation happens, and working to encourage and give attention to partnerships at local level, to ensure that appropriate instruments are there, and to really put the limelight on that level. And I think that has been relatively successful, because after all, the objective, the goal of everything we do in a conference like this, what governments do, what local governments do, is to ensure a development impact that is sustainable and that yields real impact in increasing wealth and improving the livelihoods of people. That's the only purpose, of course, with everything we do wherever we work in the system. And we are doing that in the context of increasing disaster losses and increasing disaster risk. So I think the question to all of us, can we really keep pace? Can we get ahead of that negative trend on disaster losses? And just to quote a few figures for you, disasters are not really the problem. It's us, how we organize our societies, how we plan the societies that is the problem. Not really taking notice of, if we are going to share this planet Earth with nature, we actually have to make accommodations, both us and nature, not only nature. And right now, we are, I think, behaving as if nature has to follow all our commands. Since the title of this conference is about climate adaptation, I hope you're all familiar with the IPCC special report on managing extreme events. And the only reason why I want to show it to you is read carefully the title, because what is it called? Managing the risks of extreme events and disasters to advance climate change adaptation. So the message contained in this is, yes, climate change is happening. Yes, climate change is, of course, having a negative impact on disaster risk. But it's what people do and societies do that can change that trend. So it's how do we plan cities? Where do people live? How do we manage the already well-known effects of climate change? Just to give you a few figures to take along with you and remember. In the past 30 years only, the world population has increased with 87%. I like these numbers because they show where we are in this. During that same period of 30 years, the population in very disaster-prone river basins, and some of us have visited some of them in the last few days, have increased with 114%. And in the same 30 years, the population in highly, highly disaster-prone and exposed coastlines, exposed to cyclones, typhoons, have increased with 194%. So the message is very simple. We are putting economic assets, cultural assets, people, really where they are as most exposed. And the question is, do we take sufficient measure to reduce the exposure? The exposure is largely about economic losses. Economic losses, the good news is that in East Asia, in particularly, countries have been very effective in reducing mortality in disasters because of good emergency preparedness, better education, and really targeted that this is important to do, early warning systems, evacuations, etc. But the economic losses keep going up worldwide, everywhere. Of course, in dollar terms, most in OECD countries, because they are richest, and we've seen what happened in Japan, New Zealand, Australia in the past few years. But most rapidly in middle-income countries, because the economic growth is fastest there, and not necessarily possible to keep pace with the rapid economic growth and the rapid exposure. So all this to say, we are in a great rush. We cannot not use the considerable knowledge that already exists and the experience. In Asia and Pacific region, of course, sometimes I hear people from Asia saying proudly that we have more disasters than any other region in the world, which is true because you also have more people than in any other part of the world, but you also have a huge exposure because of the lot of water, the coastlines, and the weather patterns. So the GDP exposed to floods only in this region is almost 8 times higher today in 2009 compared to 1970. And the exposure to cyclones is about 6 times higher. So in a way, we are fighting a battle with time and anticipation. So there are lots of challenges to governments, like Vietnam, but there are also lots of challenges to us as citizens. And I think we as citizens are the communities that we are going to discuss in the next few days. So while we understand that development practices, many of the things we do are in fact accumulating and creating new risks, I do believe very firmly that we also know how not to exacerbate that pattern and what measures to take. So how to make that more explicit and in practice transfer all the knowledge that exists everywhere. I think it is both an opportunity but perhaps also a challenge. Something that Vietnam has done with its long historical experience of disasters is the community-based disaster management program. It's very, very interesting and I believe very, very effective, even though it's not rolled out fully yet. It's building on the traditional knowledge and experience of communities for self-help and fend for themselves, but also an acknowledgement, of course, by the government that they have to ensure that communities are strengthening their capacity and their knowledge and their ability. And that there is no community, or barely no community, I'm sure we can find communities, that are not integrated in the modern economy, but quite marginal to many of its main benefits. But as you know, people are extremely well informed. I mean, in many of these countries, you got 70–80% coverage of mobile telephones. People know about the aspirations. They know what they aspire for. People buy TVs, they buy motorbikes, they know what they want to invest for, education for the children. So the experiences here in this community-based program that we've seen, I visited, as many of you have done, some of these communities, no roads, very exposed to some of the already very negative impact of climate change, also frequently visited by typhoons, and how people are beginning to look at adapting their livelihoods and yet try to increase their income, and improve their lives. I see it as an enormous challenge, and I must commend both the government for this strong policy, but also the local officials and many of the people for the very insightful and way of tackling this dilemma that we have to recognize between the needs and the imperative for continued economic and social development and how to make those livelihoods at local level really sustainable. And what is it? You know, I'm always so impressed by what people already know and apply. And I'm not always so impressed by what we, sort of from the top of society, the international or the national system, what can we add? What is it really our understanding of what they need? A few days ago I was in a different discussion, and one of the questions from the audience was, how do you make science and technology really available so that we people can use it? And that's of course a challenge. How do you make scientists speak in a way so that it's transferable and applicable to knowledge? And I had some very interesting reactions and also comments from some of the scientists that participated, and a certain sense of humility. So I think science, of course, is willing and ready, but they need transformation systems. They need systems that help to translate their knowledge and understanding, and communication between science and people's practitioner is probably one of the most critical ways to make really advances on tackling some of the problems that have no local solutions. I think we have to be very realistic and concrete in saying a lot can be done, but you reach the limit where there aren't any local solutions because the problems are new and they are unknown, and we don't really know how do you solve problems long-term and sustainably of the salt infiltration into agricultural land and drinking water. There are many mitigation measures, but are they sustainable long-term? I'm not so sure. I don't know. They don't look sustainable to me yet. But I'm sure there is a solution somewhere. So this strong focus on the communities, rural as well as urban communities. And we just commented before the conference opened that how do we specialists maybe and central decision makers, how do we adjust to the fact that not in Vietnam yet, but in the world overall, 50% of all communities are urban? How do you reach urban communities? They are not like rural communities. They change. They live by different standards. They organize themselves differently. And I think they very quickly also adopt different values. I understand you will discuss that here, and I would be really interested in learning something from your experiences and your advice. Finally, climate change, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. I think today we don't need to complicate too much those linkages. They have been made clear by multiple IPCC conferences. They've been made clear in this report. There is a strong policy basis from the Cancun Agreement, which says build on existing mechanisms, and the existing mechanism is the Yoga Framework for Action. It says you will gain time and resources by using known and tested disaster risk reduction measures to achieve mid-term climate adaptation measures, while we also are learning more and developing better concrete understanding of what really medium to long-term adaptation means, while also remembering that adaptation in a way is just one measure, that mitigation is what really counts. So I would encourage, as I always do, that the better integration policy-wise, institutionally, and in the practices of climate adaptation and risk reduction measures is really a critical way and acceptance to make much faster progress than we're doing. And I believe it's also a critical way to make that faster mutual learning much more effective among communities, that is already happening, but also from communities to us, and also to help policymakers to maybe more quickly take the policy recommendations that come out from good scientific basis and turn them into actionable practices, and to resource decisions, of course, because resources are critically important to assist all of you, governments, and everybody else. And also, I must say that I'm a strong believer in that we have to invest a lot more in research and development. Very often in times of financial constraints, the two things that are chopped first is research, and the second one is training, capacity strengthening. So if there are some things we would like to red circle, really, in times of distress, of fiscal distress, research, capacity strengthening, because that's where the future is, of course. So thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. I do look forward to hear the outcome of your meeting. Thank you very much. Have a good conference.